Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today I'm giving my first impressions of Kingdoms Forlorn from Into the Unknown. And Kingdoms Forlorn is a game over on Kickstarter. I'll have a link to that down below, but this one definitely falls into more of a first impressions category. In fact, this is going to be very different than my usual format of review in general in the way I approach this specific game. But let's go ahead and get into that, starting off with why this is more of a first impressions than many other games I've covered. And the first reason is it's a prototype, although that's true of a lot of games I cover, but this is very much a prototype, this is very much a work in progress, and even the rules are something that the rules were being finalized even as recently as a few days ago. They were still being finalized, pictures were being added, things were being updated, and in general, the experience that we have here, the experience that I have on the table, is a very limited view into what this world offers. It's a very limited subset of a single delve, a single exploration phase as you go through the delve, as you go through a single combat with a mob of characters, and then finally have a single boss fight. But I don't have that real sense of progression that I would have had I been approaching this from the very get-go, starting off the bat with my new character. And then there's other aspects to it as far as limitations to the game experience. This is a game that's supposed to be a solo operative game. A solo operative being a term that they've coined in which you all have your solo experience, your solo journey, and your goals that you're working on as your characters. But then you're cooperating with others. You're working together far more than you're not. It just happens to be once in a while your goals and your reasons and incentives might diverge from one another, and there things will clash. But for the most part, you're working together. For the most part, you are aligned in this cooperative experience, solo operative experience. But in this particular version of the game, you can only play as 4 characters, further adding to the limitations on the table. Past that, the rules were tough to get through. The rules of this game, and I don't know if it's so much the rules, things seem to be missing, although I could be wrong, it could have, it could be a me issue, but at the same time, this game has a lot of tedious accounting for, and I would say it wasn't until my 3rd playthrough that I felt I actually had a good handle on all the sequences of the play, of all the sequences of the ways you actually go through combat, the way you go through the different phases of a delve, the different phases of combat, all the reactions and actions, which is why between all those factors, I'm calling this a first impressions far more than a review. Additionally, it's worth noting as I get into my thoughts and impressions of the game, which to be frank are very, very mixed. It's worth noting for your own context that in terms of this game, Kingdoms Forlorn is going to be compared to KDM, to Kingdom Death Monsters, by a lot of people in the general category that it's approaching, and I understand why from what little I know of Kingdom Death Monster, but what I do know is that I haven't played Kingdom Death Monster. I don't know if Kingdom Death Monster is a game for me, and I often have my doubts, and that might apply to Kingdoms Forlorn as well. What I can tell you, for whatever context is helpful, is I've played Wild Ascent, I've played Primal, I've enjoyed both those games, but those will have small, slight overlaps with Kingdom Forlorn, and not a heavy overlap, which means I don't know whether my specific critiques about Kingdoms Forlorn, and I do have critiques. I know some of them are going to be prototype critiques, and I know some of them are going to be game critiques, but I don't know if those are Kingdoms Forlorn or the genre in general, and I think it's worth telling you that. Which is why I'd also say, make sure to keep your eyes peeled for the other coverages that you'll see on this game. A whole bunch of other channels have a copy of the game. You can expect to see a lot of coverage on it. But with that very lengthy disclaimer about everything, let's go ahead and dive into the game with a high-level overview of what Kingdoms Forlorn is. And I don't know if I'm going to use the correct terminology to describe this, but it feels like an RPG dungeon crawling, bass battling experience. It's a little bit of everything all combined into one. In the game, you're going to have your characters. You're going to have your individual characters, which in the prototype we have 4 characters, all playing together. In the actual final game, I believe there are more than 4, and I know you can mix and match them with more freedom than what we have here on the prototype. But each character is going to have their own journey, their own backstory, and the first thing worth mentioning is the story in this game is absolutely amazing. Like, it blew me away amazing, like the point that I would read this as a book if they presented in one, because it is twisted, it is dark, it is amusing, it is funny, it has those constant head-turn moments as you try to figure out, what did you just say? Did that actually just happen? Is that actually what's going on with these characters? For me, for over here, we have Fleischritter, not Fleischenritter. We have Fleischritter as one of the characters I've played. I've gone into 3 of these characters actually by now. But Fleischritter over here, Fleischritter is a character who's basically eating the meat of the monsters he's hunting. And he constantly seeks out and pursues those new tastes. And it's dark, and it's something that if you told me right here, I wouldn't be interested. But the way his narrative reads is captivating. It starts off all innocent and dry, he's a monster hunter, and then suddenly you pivot your head as you realize this thing is eating meat, and it's hunting monsters for their meat, and it's only hunting the particular egg knight that we're fighting off against. It's only hunting him because he wants to taste that fleshy, yolk-ridden. It gets dark and weird very quickly, but what I will say is by the time I got up to the boss encounter in this egg knight with Fleischritter, I was actually intrigued to read what happened. I was intrigued to see whether he got what he wanted out of that scenario, because the story very much pulled me in. And across the board, all the character story, I think, is absolutely amazing in the general writing that we have. Again, prototypes, so we have a limited subset, but I think the story that they're presenting and the world they're presenting is absolutely amazing. But we're kind of getting distracted here. Going back to the general idea of what this game is, you're going to have your characters and you're going to be going through a sequences of delves. Delves are going to be a combination of exploring the world and then having a clash after it, having fights and combats with either mobs of enemies or a boss fight instead. And each of them will have their own AI and way you approach the combat, so there are differences. You'll have to learn those. You effectively have to learn 3 different games to play this. You have to learn the delve sequencing, the mob sequencing, and the boss sequencing as you go through the game. And you're trying to level up, find more gear, pursue your story paths, engage with the world around you, again, through that sequences of delves and clash. So that sequences of exploring, finding out more, interacting with exploration cards, getting a little bit more narrative or taste of what's going on in the world, followed by those actual tactical sequences as you set up the board, try to prep it for whatever's going on there, putting down the various terrain around the board, the various characters you can be engaging with, both your own heroes, the enemies, and having that back and forth as you try to survive across combat that is increasingly more difficult as you go through it in even this limited set that we have over here. That's the high level overview of what's going on. From there, we're going to start diving into more of the mechanics as I go through what I like and don't like about the game. And again, there's some aspects of the game that definitely intrigue me and definitely pull me in. The story being easily the highlight, for better or for worse, the story is the highlight for me. But there are other aspects of this gameplay that pull me in, and we'll get to all of those. But I'm going to start with a negative. The first negative I have is that delve sequence. You're going to have your little party token, and you're going to go through a delve sequence as you draw a card, and then manage your threat on the track as you set up this card. We're going to a medium tile over here, so we place this card over here, we cross the terrain, we gather clue tokens, various clue tokens that are going to help us in our journey. Every character, like I said already, has their own goals that they're going through, and as you cross these various pathways from one card to the next, you're going to be managing your threat as well as your curse over there. You're going to be drawing exploration cards, resolving whatever effect is on those cards, some of which will be modified by your threat or curse, having additional effects on them, and possibly giving you tactical reasons to go one way or another. Things that are having gates slammed down behind you, having monsters hunting you, running into dead ends as you go through this exploration phase. But you're effectively drawing a card, moving around, collecting clues, and resolving random events. And to me, I didn't love that phase at all. It's something that I don't mind doing, to be very clear. It's not that it was bad, but I would say it also didn't add value to my experience. It reminds me almost of playing through Etherfields by Awakened Realms, where I had these sequences that alternated between the game that I enjoyed and then just other exploration stuff that felt like it was there to give more to the experience, but more that I hadn't asked for. And in the case of the delves, that's where I feel with them. I feel that the exploration cards are fine, and they do result in you reading passages of text that I do enjoy. But you can also read those passages of text without having the delve phase, as they clearly illustrate by having tons of passages of text that happen outside of the delve phase. And so for me, the delve phase, while not being bad, also didn't add value. It felt tedious, it felt boring, it felt like the kind of thing that I would grow to become more and more frustrated with as I play through the game, although again, healthy reminder and caveat that this is a prototype. So I don't know how those things are going to iterate. I don't know what mechanics they have planned as far as keeping it fresh and interesting and different through multiple plays. For myself, if the delve phase remains as it is, and if it remains the same across multiple games, I would grow far more frustrated with it and look for ways to skip it, as I have when I've encountered other grind-like elements in games like this. So the delve is the first con that I didn't find it an issue, I just found it unsatisfying. From there, when you're done with the delve phase, you're going to go ahead and set up in the combat, which is where far more of my review is going to focus on, because I don't know if there's that much more to talk about as far as the delve phase. There's some random skill checks, there's some mitigation, there are other aspects going on there, but none of them I think are that notable outside of what we're going to cover, outside of what we covered already. Which brings us to more of the combat, where we're going to set up the board with various terrain on the board, various elements. What I'm setting up right here is just to get stuff on the board. No actual map or scenario from what we had over here is going to exactly mimic this. But you're going to set up the board and start engaging with the combat. You'll have your various characters, which could be these various mobs that you're dealing with, which all have their own aspect and own type. Again, in this prototype, we only have one mob and one boss, and we're trying to do the best with what we have over here, but every mob will have their own flavor. Every mob will have their own decks of cards. You're going to have decks of cards representing their AI and their body parts, and mobs and bosses are going to operate differently. Mobs are going to have a bunch of cards that you lay out at the top, and as you engage with the mob, as you hit them, you'll check their number, reveal their card, and get a bit of a flavor as far as what you're encountering, what you're engaging, and how strong that enemy is, and what that enemy's unique playstyle is, meaning all the enemies all the enemies within a mob operate with some degree of similarity because they represent that type of creature. But each one is still unique. Each one has a slightly different flavor. When you hit one enemy, you don't know exactly how they're going to react. And Kingdoms Forlorn, as a pro category, it does capture that feeling of having a bunch of things that feel the same while also being unique and different. Contrast with other games, the Zombicide is going to be a classic of mine, where every zombie has their exact same pre-programmed sequence. Kingdoms Forlorn steps heavily away from that. Creatures in this game basically feel similar because they maintain that mob mentality, they maintain that aspect. In the case of these creatures, they're trying to gang you up, they're trying to push you together and because they get stronger as they attack you in a group. And so they all maintain that flavor, but still being different at the same time. There's a degree of unpredictability to it, for better or for worse. You might be someone who wants that predictability because you want that tactical challenge of exactly how to plan around things. And this game won't give you that. It'll give you the general archetype of what's going on. It'll give you the general idea of what's happening, but you will have a degree of unknown. This, like the name of the company, you're venturing into the unknown over here. And so there's always a degree of uncertainty as far as how any character is going to react, which falls into the pro category. It keeps things fresh, it keeps things interesting, it keeps things different as you go through it. Past that, the game in general, and this will apply to the bosses and the mobs themselves, it has what they've coined the inverted combat paradigm. This is something they had in their prior game, A.S. Trespass Odyssey. The idea that as you fight, as you engage, everyone is powering up. So as you play through the game, as your characters start getting weaker, you're going to be tracking your health. There's two different arcs here. There's the Peril arc and the Heroic arc, and one's going to be tracking your health, and as your health gets lower and lower, you're able to maintain and carry more heat. And that's important because heat is a resource that allows you to do things. It allows your abilities to activate, your rerolls, different things in the game will utilize your heat, which having more room for that heat is a good thing. So having your health go down has your heat going higher. Think of it as your desperation almost in terms of what you can do. It's some sort of resource that you're trying to manage. The downside that you want to be mindful of is heat will often attract various enemies too. As you flip over those cards from the enemies, sometimes they're going to say things like, if you have 3 heat, then this extra thing happens. The more deadly you are, the more vengeful you are, the more you're doing, the more you attract the attention of these characters that are trying to kill you. Then past that, you have your Heroic arc, which as well as every single round as you attack, you're going to be powering up your Heroic arc, which is going to give you more room to get things done. So as you get weaker, you're getting stronger. As you attack, you're getting stronger. This game is going to be escalating you as you go through the game, and that's true of the enemies as well. The enemies, depending on whether you're talking about the mobs or the bosses, are slightly different. The mobs, whenever you defeat the mob, whenever you deal a wound to a mob and take one out, you're going to add a higher level card to their AI deck. The AI deck is how they operate when it's their turn. So in addition to having their own little individual profile, they have a general AI deck that represents what they're doing and how they're attacking, and those cards are going to become more dangerous as you deal wounds, as you take out the enemies. And so the enemies are escalating as you are escalating. You deal damage to them, they get stronger. They deal damage back to you now that they're stronger, and you get stronger, and you have that slow power creep in the game as you take them out. The boss is going to double down on that in the sense that they're going to be escalating both their AI deck. When you have that Ignite over here, you're going to be escalating both his AI deck, but you're also going to be escalating his actual body parts as well. So he's escalating in 2 forms, because unlike these mobs over here where you have cards that represent each individual character, the boss has a body part deck that represents his body parts that you're going through. And so again, he's leveling up in 2 senses as you go through him, as you fight him, representing even more of a challenge. And that general sense of escalation, that inverted combat paradigm, is something I haven't seen done in a lot of games, or at least if it is, I don't know about it. But it's a feature that's present in one of my favorite games of all time, Cthulhu Death May Die, and I've loved it when I've seen it. That idea of ramping up, that idea of escalation, I like that idea because it keeps things fresh, rather than slowly failing forward, rather than slowly having things happen to you and you creeping downwards. You get more wounded, so you can roll less dice. You get more wounded, you roll less dice, and just having that slow, just not fun element to a game. Rather than just not having that, Into the Unknown with both their games have leaned against that, and having that inverted combat paradigm, letting you do more things as you go. Now, going to the con aspect of this, I wish some of the things were a bit cooler. Holding on to more heat is useful, don't get me wrong, it is very, very useful. And these abilities each character gets, they're useful, but very little of what you do as you power up falls into the cooler category. They're definitely impactful, they definitely matter, they definitely will add break tokens, they're going to add rerolls, they're going to add modifiers and extra things to you. The fact that you can carry more heat matters. it just feels like little stat increases as opposed to anything else. And speaking for myself and my own preferences, I like cooler abilities. I like unlocking things that you can actually do that are more interesting and fun, as opposed to effectively what is mostly minor stat increases as you go through it. So I like the system. I wish it was a bit more interesting in the terms of the general implementation from it. Past that, let's see where else we are over here. So let's talk about the icons over here. Because in general, one of the issues I have is that this game has a lot of fiddliness to it. A lot of fiddliness in different ways. It has fiddliness in terms of the icons, it has fiddliness in terms of the sequencing, and it's worth noting that many of my complaints that I'll get into now might just come down to the fact that I don't like games that have that much checking on every aspect of them. And this game has a lot of checking. There's a lot of things. You're going to be rolling dice to see if you hit the enemies. You're going to be rolling dice once you establish you've hit the enemies. You're going to be rolling dice to see if you actually deal damage to them as well. They're going to be rolling dice to see if they hit you. Once they hit you, you're going to be rolling an armor roll. Various things are going to involve skill checks. You're going to be rolling dice for those. There is roll mitigation. There is dice mitigation in the game, so there are opportunities to get around those options, but there's a lot of dice rolling in this game, a lot of checking of what happens as you go through it. There's going to be a lot of sequences that you have to manage over there. Okay, great, I'm going to go ahead and attack you. I'm going to look at the card, what happens, what goes through there. Oh, you're going to attack back, you're going to move towards me, I'm going to go ahead and react, I'm going to evade, I'm going to jump around, I'm going to roll my armor roll. The jumping around I just made up, that's not there, but I'm going to go ahead and evade, I'm going to roll my armor roll. You're going to have constantly be checking various things in the game, from the characters themselves, from their AI cards, from the body parts, from the specific, when you pull out the boss, you're going to have his trade cards, you're going to have to be managing them. There's going to be new rule sets frequently brought into play, as far as every time you have a new enemy, there's going to be new rule sets to manage and be on top of, which is not a problem in of itself, but this game already has a lot to manage in terms of the general sequencing. And it's going to be just one more thing. You're never fully going to be in the clear. You're always going to have more enemies, more bosses, more things to learn, and it's important that those things be clear. And speaking for myself, speaking for the prototype, I would say that not all of those things have been totally clear. There are times where we've had to make judgment calls as far as how something operates, because it wasn't necessarily in the rules and it wasn't fully clarified on the cards themselves, and that hopefully is something that is more of a prototype issue. But I found there's just a lot of checking in the game. There's a lot of sequencing getting in the way of the experience. And going to the iconography, which I touched upon briefly, but the iconography in the game is not great either. Icons across the board are tiny. That's going to be true of the Dell phase as well, by the way. There's going to be I'm going to show this to you, and I know there's something that they're already fixing. So again, prototype review over here, prototype first impressions. But some of the icons over here are minuscule in terms of being able to look at them and see what happens. As you go through the Dell phase, you're going to be looking at those icons and trying to gather those clues. Those are already being fixed, they're already being improved. But that's going to be true over here on this chart over here. As you go through these icons, these are minuscule icons, and what's made worse is that many icons are similar to one another in generally what's going on. So you kind of have to get to a point where you know your character has that set of icons over the other, and you will get to know your characters, to be fair, but a lot of iconography in the game, a lot of skills to remember, a lot of terms to remember, a lot of things to go through. There's pages worth of these icons and what they mean and how they interact, and you will slowly get better at them, you will slowly learn them, but it's definitely a lot to take on, and it's something that I think they're going to need an amazing player aid, and it's one of those difficult challenges because it's a player aid that will potentially be overwhelming at first, because when you first dive into the game, hopefully they're revealing these icons to you slowly but surely. But having that access, having that option to have some sort of quick reference as opposed to diving into the rulebook every time you have an icon is going to be incredibly important. But there's a lot of fiddliness to the general game experience. I talked about the dice rolling already. There's a lot of dice rolling. There is mitigation around it, which means I don't hate it, but I also don't love it. The fact that I'm rolling dice and the fact that I can go ahead and roll my die and then just have no turn, that can absolutely happen and will happen multiple times. Your character is going to roll to attack, and if they miss that attack, then they're going to skip their entire turn. For the most part, you'll go to the final end ability phase, but you're going to miss a lot of what's going on if you just don't connect. So that's going to be an option, a problem on the table as well, where you can have a character, especially if you're playing it as a 4-player game where everyone's controlling one character, or whatever player count. But if you're playing it a 3 or 4-player game, but effectively if every player is controlling one character, then having your character miss just means you do nothing on your turn. It's the next person's turn, and they can go ahead and do their thing, which is just generally not satisfying. Now that problem will be mitigated if you're controlling 2 characters each, but I can't speak for what the design of the game is, but it feels, especially because of the rich narrative aspect of the characters, this is a game where I kind of only want to control a single character. I want to be invested in that character's journey. These are not just creatures on a map. They actually matter, and their story matters, and I only want to play one character at a time, but that does mean that when I roll a die and I don't connect, it means I'll have a wasted turn. Now that, again, something that might be less of an issue as you go through the game, as you find even more equipment or ways to mitigate, but for right now, the dice rolling is not the best for me, but also not the worst overall. Additionally, there's a bigger issue, I would say, is that I found that there's often it depends on the situation. There's less player agency than I'd like, but this is where that whole being thrown down into the middle of a journey is a bit of a toss-up. You see, in general, games like this, games like Kingdom Death Monster, games like Wild Descent, games like Primal, games that Oathsworn, any of these games, there's two aspects to the game. There's the actual encounter you have on the table, and then there's the building up of your character, the boosting their stats, the finding their gear. And even just now, I can tell you, this is one of the pros over here, from looking through this deck of gear over here, I am incredibly intrigued, both with the thematic and the mechanical aspect of actually having a full gear progression of Into the Unknown, of Kingdoms Forlorn, of having that full progression of building out my own character, developing their skills, getting their gear. I'm very interested in that. But that's not what I have over here on the prototype. While in theory they do have the option to kind of dive into like higher levels as you go through it, you really just have a single scenario, a single encounter to go through here, and that means limited player agency in terms of the way I can actually build out my character, which means I'm focusing not on the character that I've built that I would do in a full real game, again, first impressions, but rather on the experience that I have here on the table, which doesn't have that. And to that end, without having that, I feel like I'm just doing the best I can with what I have, and most of the time, I feel like the choices are fairly obvious. Most of the time. Now, this is something where other players can play the game and say, no, there's nuance here, there's nuance here. It's entirely possible there is. Entirely possible. But I would say for the most part, I feel that I'm going to go ahead and attack. I'm going to attack that character because it makes sense to attack that character. I'm going to roll dice because I'm rolling dice. And there's not a lot of agency or mitigation past the obvious ones. If I fail, I might spend a heat to re-roll it. That makes sense. We'll go ahead and do that. But most of the time, the actions or the pathways forward, I felt were not that nuanced in terms of the options on the table. This is a problem, to be very fair. This is a problem in many other games in this genre, I believe, or at least my own experience with those games, but I just didn't have the chance to feel the player agency of building out my character and making that problem feel worse. So I'm not sure what the final game will feel like. For myself, I just didn't feel the degree of player agency I would like relative to the amount of paperwork and maintenance of what's going on. Doing this to then flip that card and check that reaction and go through those sequences that are tedious, they become more frustrating when I feel that I'm mostly just doing what is, in my opinion, the more obvious move. And part of that problem is made worse by the fact that I just didn't find these cards, the player cards. The players are going to have their various cards, and again, it's something you can build out across the course of the game. It's something that you're going to have those differences that are going to develop. But as far as my experience over here, these cards just didn't feel that interesting. They give you things that matter and they can be impactful. Being able to dodge out of a roll, being able to move in extra space, those things are impactful, but they didn't feel that interesting to me. And it also led to the characters just not feeling different enough to me, at least right now. Their access to gear, that feels important. What type of archetypes are these characters? What does one feel like versus another? I didn't feel any strong aspect of tanking or healing or damage dealing or magic. I didn't feel any of those aspects at all because I didn't feel enough differences in terms of how the characters played. It felt like minor stat boosts in terms of their engagement. I had fun with them. Their backstories are vastly different. The mechanical aspect, it's hard to talk upon with the prototype I have over here with the limited experience. I see the promise of the feature, but I didn't get to experience that major difference overall. One more pro before we move into final thoughts. The teamwork options in this game can be high, and this almost goes counter to that player agency I talked about briefly, but I would say it's not so much an issue of player agency. I still feel like I'm primarily making the obvious choice, but there is a strong sense of teamwork in the game. There's going to be teamwork in the fact that you can play cards to help other players. There's going to be teamwork in the fact that as you go through the various action phases, your combat phase is going to have basically like 10 action phases, 10 phases you're checking through as you go through each thing. But once you clear this pool, you're going to have the concept of this common pool over here where you're going to put tokens that help you in your combat. And you can utilize those tokens for yourself to go ahead and do your own combat and do your own thing, or if you wait till your second action phase, which is especially relevant if you find yourself in a situation where you can't get an obvious hit in. You're dealing with a boss and he's overpowered right now. You're dealing with a specific level 3 character and that's all you can reach or hit. If you just feel you're not going to have the opportunity to get done what you want to get done, you can instead spend your turn preparing to help the next player. That's going to be true when you fail a hit as well. Very often when you fail a hit, sometimes when you succeed, but you have to get overpowered to do so. When you fail a hit, you'll be able to save a die for the next player, letting them have a higher chance of hitting. The enemy's distracted, the enemy's weakened, you've struck a blow, you've done what you need to do, and now they're a little bit more weakened in preparation for the next player. Tier off that, the fact that you can then start adding tokens to the pool, tokens that will help that next player, adding break tokens, adding opening tokens, giving them more of an opportunity to succeed where you failed. And this game does have a high feeling of working together, a high feeling of despite the terminology solo operative, it feels like the operative part. That doesn't sound right, operative is its own word. It feels like the cooperative element of the gameplay. And so they have that going for them. as far as final thoughts, and I'm not going to be rating this one. I'm not. I'll go very much into where I stand on this one right now, at least based on my experience with it. But as far as final thoughts on Kingdoms Forlorn, I think the biggest thing I got out of this experience is the sense of promise and potential of what this game can be, but I don't feel like I got to experience that. And I don't know if that's a prototype issue or if that's just this isn't my genre. Some of the aspects in this game are incredible. The taste of like going through these cards, again, both from a thematic aspect as well as from a mechanical aspect, you'll have cards in here that represent some aspect of the challenges you had. You'll have your yoke-tipped spear, the idea that you've taken down the Ignite and now you have this specific piece of gear that in some way is dipped in, it's not really its blood, but it's yoke, and you're going to have these modifiers and these weapon aspects, and you're going to build out your character, and then the opportunity to have different characters to engage in the story, to add to their action cards. This game gives me a big sense of promise, of potential of what the game could be, and at the same time, I felt like they actually had on the table often felt more fiddly than it was fun, at least for myself. And again, I don't know if it's a prototype thing or if it's a genre thing. I don't know, or if it's specifically a Kingdoms Forlorn thing. It could be either. It could be the game itself, it could be a prototype, or it could be a genre thing. But I felt like there were a lot of opportunities to do fun things. There were lots of moments where I had like, okay, great, I'll roll dice. Okay, great, look, I was able to take down that aspect. I was able to take down that level 3 creature. I was able to crack through the Ignite's armor. We sent him crashing and columning into a pillar, dropping off pieces of his armor, spreading his own pillars in return. There were moments of impactful elements in the gameplay that were fun. And there was lots of cards in here that I want to explore and want to dive into it, seeing that over there. But at the same time, for myself, and again, potentially a genre thing, I don't feel like I'm interested in the maintenance it takes to get there. I want to go through my character story. I want to see the pathway and progression, but I don't know if I care about the degree of maintenance this game has, combined with the degree of player agency that I personally felt to be willing to go through all of that to get there. I don't know. I'm very, very curious, and I have to play Kingdom Death Monster at some point to see where it lands for me. I don't know, but there's too many small things. Whenever, every single time you level up a mob, every single time you level up a boss, you're going to be constantly shuffling in the deck, which means this is a game that I would be very, very hesitant to play it solo again. Because, speaking for myself, playing it with 3 players was a much better experience, both from the sense of teamwork it gave us, as well as from the sense of the fact that you're not dealing with everything yourself. One player is dealing with moving that mob and reading the next AI card, and another person shuffling in the new cards and dealing with that aspect. Dealing with it solo was a significantly slower experience as you try to get everything done yourself, especially, I will caveat, I'm controlling 4 characters here, so it does make it even more complicated. I think where I end up with Kingdoms Forlorn is, it's a game that I think, if you told me you loved this game, I wouldn't be surprised. If you told me you hated this game, I wouldn't be surprised. For myself, I wish my first opportunity to dive into this had not been the prototype I got. I wish the first chance I had to explore Kingdoms Forlorn was diving into a fresh game, going through an ideal experience, because diving into this made me less in a rush to dive into it a second time. It's not that I don't see promise, it's not that I don't see potential, it's that what I do see is a lot of work and effort to get to the gameplay aspects that I liked, to get to the story that I liked. So I'm left very, very mixed on what this is or was or is intended to be. I see the promise, I see the potential, and I don't know if it's for me. I hope you found this in some way helpful. Again, I do recommend checking out the various other content creators who are covering this game, because there are a bunch, and I've already seen both positive and negative reception, which means this is very, very interesting to see where this one ends up. In any case, I hope you found it helpful. I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and as always, have a good one.